Welcome back to Global Lens. U.S. President Donald Trump has described his ongoing spat with China as a full-blown trade war. The comments come just 2 weeks before his scheduled meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea. Trump has threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese goods and is considering ending the U.S. cooking oil trade with China, accusing Beijing of deliberately halting soybean purchases from the U.S. In a post on Truth Social, President Trump called China's actions economically hostile. China, the world's largest soybean buyer, has largely shifted its sourcing to Brazil and Argentina since 2024. Reports suggest Chinese cooking oil shipments to the U.S. have dropped by 65% over the past year. That's not all. The U.S. imposed charges on owners and operators of Chinese-built, owned or operated vessels entering the country. China on the 10th of October retaliated and increased port fees on American vessels. China has also expanded export curbs on rare earths and related technologies from the 8th of November. The expanding list now covers 12 out of the 17 types of rare earths, lithium-ion battery materials, and synthetic diamonds. However, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that there could be a possibility of extending a pause on duties on Chinese goods for longer than 3 months if China halts its plan for strict new export controls on rare earth elements. Adding to tensions, the Dutch government recently seized control of semiconductor firm Nexperia from China's Wingtech technology soon after a Dutch court suspended Wingtech's Chinese founder. The move followed U.S.'s pressure on the Netherlands to remove Chinese ownership risk being added to a trade blacklist. Joining us right now on the program is Peter Landers, Asia Business, Finance and Economic Editor at the Wall Street Journal. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Now, this was a story that the Wall Street Journal reported on in great detail. U.S. pressurizing Netherlands to oust the CEO of a Chinese-owned chip maker. Tell us how this is going to play out in the weeks to come. What's been the reaction from China to this?
China has responded with very strong words. They're calling this banditry. They're saying the Netherlands looted the company, basically accusing them of stealing Chinese assets. And of course, the Netherlands saying they did it according to their laws. But from China's perspective, this is certainly a hostile action. And it adds yet another issue to the long list that you just gave of issues for President Trump and President Xi to hash out.
Right. I would also like to ask you, is the U.S. pressurizing other players, other nations in Europe to do the same as well?
I think this is a particular case involving one company that where the Dutch subsidiary of the Chinese parent was susceptible to U.S. pressure. But in general, the U.S. is throwing its weight around, and a lot of countries around the world pressuring them to join its side. Even, as you know, in the case of India, the U.S. is pressuring India not to buy Russian oil, for example. That doesn't involve China necessarily, but even with regards to China, I think the U.S. is pressuring allies to join its effort.
Right. Peter, what I'd like to understand from you, that in the case of Nexperia, why did the U.S. act in this manner? Why this particular company specifically?
Yeah, it's not a super large semiconductor company. It uses older technology, but still its chips are used in a variety of goods, such as cars. And I think the U.S. just wanted to warn the Netherlands that, look, right now, the Nexperia parent company in China is under U.S. blacklist measures. And the U.S. was saying, look, if you don't remove Chinese control and remove the Chinese CEO from the Dutch subsidiary, then that subsidiary is also eventually going to be subject to this U.S. blacklist. So do what you want, but just take note that this Dutch company is at risk. And so I think the Dutch government, although it's saying it acted on its own to remove it from Chinese control, certainly this U.S. pressure played a big role.
Right. Peter, just to understand from you, how do you see this trade war intensifying? U.S. President Donald Trump has said that this is going to become a full-blown trade war. We've seen him blow hot and cold as far as tensions with China go ahead of those negotiations. But currently, how do you expect China's response to be in the days to come? And how hard could China's retaliation impact the United States?
China has this trump card, you might say, of rare earths, which they've already used once this year and have begun to use again, that these rare earth metals and magnets are widely used in electronic products, also in weapons. And by cutting off the supply of these rare earths, China can really hit the US economy and the global economy. So, and the US has tools of its own, of course. And so each side, I think, as you said, is blowing hot and cold. They're making big threats and pumping out their chests and saying, we will not yield to you under any circumstances. But at the same time, you also hear from both sides that they're ready to negotiate. And at another occasion, Donald Trump said, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. On one occasion, China said that these latest rare earth export controls were actually not that a big deal, not such a big deal. And don't worry, companies will be able to navigate these just fine. It won't affect the global economy. So each side is really playing both sides as they head into negotiations. And it's not certain that the two presidents, President Trump and President Xi, will actually meet this month in South Korea, but they're certainly planning for such a meeting.
Right. I would also like to ask you about the impact on maritime trade between the two nations. Additional port fees on shipping vessels being imposed by both sides. To what extent is this likely to impact maritime trade?
It will raise costs mainly for U.S. consumers because a lot of the ships docking at U.S. ports do come from China, and they're made in China. It's by far the dominant shipbuilding power in the world today. And so it does affect the global trade, mainly, again, for the U.S., that simply bringing these goods into the United States on a Chinese ship will raise costs and ultimately hit the U.S. consumer, just like tariffs are beginning to hit the U.S. consumer. So it's yet another issue, and it's a tit-for-tat case. The U.S. imposed fees on Chinese ships, and of course, China feels like they can't show any weakness, so they have to do the same on U.S. ships, although there are fewer U.S.-made ships docking in China, but just tit-for-tat, they're following through on that. And so the two leaders really have a lot of issues to sort out if they do want to get down to that level of detail, and if they ever meet.
Right. When it comes to the extent of restrictions, the new restrictions by China, export controls on lithium-ion batteries, on rare earths, which are going to come into effect from the 8th of November, how widespread will be the impact on U.S. companies specifically? This impacts every nation around the world, India as well, but specifically on U.S. tech sector, the U.S. defense sector, what's going to be the large impact? And does this mean that U.S. is entering negotiations with China on a weaker footing?
It does affect the U.S. footing entering negotiations. And earlier this year, China put curbs on rare earth metals. And for example, Ford, the U.S. Automaker, had to shut down some production lines. And so it really depends on how they apply these restrictions. And I went through the language of them in detail and with colleagues as well, and trying to figure out exactly what products are covered. Is it just rare earth metals and rare earth magnets, or is it actually many more products that just have a small portion of these metals in them? Actually, if you look at the documents issued by the Chinese side, it's quite hard to tell what exactly they mean to do. And I suppose that gives them flexibility at the negotiating table. They can say, well, we'll interpret it this way, and it's not that important, or we could interpret it in a maximal way and really punish you guys. So that's what China is bringing to the negotiating table, and certainly a chip that it can play.
Right. My final question would be about India, Peter. You know, India and China ties have been going through some sort of reset over the past few months. Having said that, do you expect China to make any concessions on rare earth for India? We've seen visas being allowed once again by both sides. Flights will now start taking off for both countries. Air connectivity is going to resume. Border trade has resumed as well. But would you say this is just the low-hanging fruit? But when it comes to those substantial restrictions on rare earth magnets, export controls on maybe high technology equipment, could there be more curbs coming India's way?
I think there could be, and with regard to any major country, even India, I think China has these cards that they play from time to time, whether it be flights or export of certain materials that are needed for manufacturing in India, export of energy perhaps, or allowing, for example, Chinese experts to, people to travel to India to help Indian factories get underway and learn some of the technology where China may be more advanced. They have so many tools they can use when they're trying to threaten or cajole a country like India, with which relations are always at some level of tension.
All right, Peter Landers, thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18 to speak about the latest round of US-China tensions, both sides ratcheting up the rhetoric and ratcheting up the regulatory pressures ahead of those high-stakes negotiations. Let's move on and get you